Hello and welcome again. This is part 2 of Computer Side Chat on the Crusades. Obviously, I'm wearing my crown today, so I'm pretty excited I get to be king. You know, in the first part, Mr. Armstrong got to be the Pope, but I'm just wearing the crown for a little starter here. So while Mr. Armstrong is pulling up the presentation, I'll kind of reiterate. He can screen share and he can take over the screen, but I'll reiterate what we did in Computer Side Chat 1. Discussing the we then went into Pope Urban II and his speech where he says that God wills it. We talked about the politics going on, how the Christians unite, stop fighting one another, coming to the aid of the Byzantine Empire. So when we ended, the Christians had led the siege on Jerusalem, and they now controlled Jerusalem and made it a Christian kingdom. That lasted for about 80 years, and then we'll pick it up there. Mr. Armstrong, if you want to do the Second Crusade.
Okay, so during the Second Crusade, the roles are reversed here a little bit. The First Crusade was caused because the Muslims weren't allowing the Christians to come in and visit the Holy City. And now it's the other way around because the Christians are now occupying, controlling much of the land, and they are now preventing and not allowing the Muslims to come in and visit the Holy Land. So the roles have kind of reversed with what caused the second one compared to what caused the first.
Yeah, so I drew a line on there, and the Christians pretty much are controlling the area inside the line. So all of this area is Christians, but they're surrounded by Muslims. And that's when Saladin comes into the picture. So after 80 years of Christian rule, Saladin basically comes into the picture, and they begin harassing, they begin not allowing the Muslims to come into the Holy Land. So that's when the Muslims strike, and basically Jerusalem falls to the Muslims. So all of a sudden, we're now to the following image. And this is all controlled by the Muslims. There's no longer a king of Jerusalem, that it's a Christian. And we have the Second Crusade. So the Pope at the time, about 50, 60 years later, calls the next crusade. This one doesn't end very well for the Christians, as you can see in the text. Mainly the King of France and the King of Germany head off on the Crusades. Demolished when they reach Damascus. So when they get to here, they are totally demolished and they are forced to go home. It's basically pretty quickly over. So this is when the Muslims are all united. A little idea of how he united them was where if you've played Assassin's Creed, the video game takes place during this time period. And Saladin was the first to kind of coin the term assassin. So he was able to unite the Muslims by basically killing his opposition and uniting the Muslims under his domain. So he becomes Sultan Saladin, which Sultan means king. After the Second Crusade, the Muslims control all of the Holy Land, and life isn't going so well. Anything you want to add there?
No, possibly, but it's cutting in and out, so I'm having a hard time hearing different things. So I don't want to reiterate or confuse anything by not flowing with what you're saying. So
on to the next slide. Is going to really open the door up to the two most famous people. First, there was King Barbarossa, who I put the phrase, he's a poor guy. King Barbarossa leaves with 100,000 men and 20,000 knights and probably can defeat Saladin single-handedly. The problem is he gets somewhere over in this area on his tour, about halfway, and he falls off his horse, hits his head in a rock, and whether he has a heart attack or dies, the majority of the people, probably 90%, turn around and go home. So they're gone. They are off the picture. They never make it. So that leaves about 5,000 actually make it to the Holy Land. But in steps King Richard the Lionheart, the King of England. And he can kind of outline that 500 miles. This is no better than traveling by land. In some ways, it's maybe worse. Weapons, there's nowhere for rest. And vomiting. This is not a pleasant way to travel back in these days for war. It's not like a humongous. This was a very terrible way to travel. We're probably not going to go too deep into the. We'll come back to King Richard in Quest 9, which deals with the Magna Carta. He has something to do with that as well. But in the end, there's a truce. Richard goes home. Saladin kind of controls all the land. But once again, the Christians fail to take over. Potentially 8 more crusades, but they all end the same way. People go part way. Some of them die. There was one crusade, which these are pretty sad concepts, really, as you look into it. How many people started on these crusades but never could even make it to the Holy Land? But that's your job to study a little bit in the quest. So we're going to move on to the effects of the. Mr. Armstrong, since we're cutting out on your end, maybe I'll let you talk a little bit about the effects, and then I'll reiterate anything.
Okay, so the end results of the crusade, the more obvious one is the fact that people lost lives going on the crusades and so on. But the ones that are probably even more important than that is the idea that this idea of cultural diffusion, and we've talked quite a bit about that throughout the year. But to kind of highlight a few things that are occurring here, you've got whenever you have war, or people interact with others from a distance or from a different area, they get access or they see their way of life. So whether they're seeing other type of clothing, different type of architecture, different values and living. So maybe they see, so the Western Europeans would see, they would see the value that the Muslims are holding into education. And then Mr. Holman's kind of writing a few things on here. So you have the exchange of food and weapons, cultural diffusion, the idea that all of these things are being transferred from one area to the other, simply because they are in contact with one another.
Yeah, I mean, I find out that the Muslims, unlike the Christians, who kind of lost track of Rome and what Rome and Greece had done in the classic age of those time periods, the Muslims continued to read Roman knowledge and they continue to build on it. So what is really important, and maybe to get the kids to kind of think about, if I can erase some of this stuff real quick. I think I erased maybe too far. But anyways, if I can say it, I don't know if I can still draw on this, but the staircase comes back to us. See, as the Christians lost track of that staircase doing that was amazing, the Muslims kept building on that. So they continued to go forward as we progressed on. So there's my little staircase. So they continued to build up. And so now the Christians are learning that life doesn't have to be here. We can go up here. And it's going to explode into a whole new world that's going to open up to the Europeans. And they really have to thank the Muslims for that. Said there were some really bad things that occurred because of the Crusades. There was a deep hatred towards the religions Muslims and vice versa. You know, maybe some of that can still be seen in the world today. You know, there's issues with the Jewish population. They were slaughtered by the Christians on the trips. So there's a lot of anger and frustration that is also building up in society. And that will come back throughout history to show its face again. So it's not only positive things that come out of the Crusades, there are some negative things. And as you read a bit about the food and cultural diffusion, up the world to Europe. Europe sees the world again for the first time in 800 years. They begin to look beyond Europe at what else is out there. And that's going to get rid of the Middle Ages. They're beginning to decline at this point. This is the beginning of the end, I guess, for the Middle Ages. Anything you want to add before we call it a day today?
No, I want to apologize with the connection.
Well, we do the best we can. All right. Well, for that, today we'll come back to the Crusades. Hopefully you'll learn a lot about the Crusades. Make sure you look at the story of, just a real quick plug here, make sure you look at the story of King Richard Lionheart trying to get home back to Europe, what happens to him. You know, that's a fascinating story, and it'll come back into play on the next quest. Have a good day.